Hello. Today we will be discussing the decolonization movements in Africa and Asia that occurred during the mid to late 20th century. Earlier in the year, we discussed how with the rise of industrialized states in Europe during the mid-1800s came the rise of imperialism, or the conquering of less industrialized nations in Africa and Asia. After World War I, most imperialized countries will begin the process of what's called decolonization. You can see from the map here which areas of Africa and Asia were conquered by each of the European countries. We will see some mixed results in the government and economic styles of these newly freed countries, as well as just overall success levels. For example, after the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, China will remain communist in name, but they will adopt many capitalist reforms to encourage their economic growth. It is also during this time period that trade starts to become more global as technology expands and new corporations are able to do business all around the globe. The word globalization will be used for the first time. We also start to see more ethnic conflicts, a large majority happening in the newly freed countries in Africa. We also start to see the rise of terrorism and religious extremism emerge throughout the world. Most of the major independence movements we will discuss today come as a result of World War II. The first major colony that will gain independence is India in 1947. Most of these independence movements will begin because of their resentment of their mother country. So in India's case, this will be Great Britain. During the First World War, India was asked to send troops to fight with the British with the promise that the Indians would be granted some self-rule as a reward for their participation. But then, of course, at the end of World War I, they were not granted the self-rule they were promised, and instead, tensions against their mother countries grew worse as nationalism and demands for independence increases. One of the most famous leaders to emerge out of these movements is someone you've probably heard of, Mohandas Gandhi. He will take charge of the Indian independence movement in the 1920s. Gandhi's approach is to use non-violent tactics to achieve the goals of his movement. He understands that the Indian people do not have the military experience to organize themselves in a violent revolution, and would do better bringing global recognition to his cause by basically embarrassing the British on the global stage. Gandhi's tactics mostly included breaking British laws he deemed to be unfair to the Indian people in acts of civil disobedience. He participated in things like boycotts of British goods, so they just don't buy the goods at all, peaceful protests, and he even stops eating at some point in a hunger strike to get his points across. Gandhi's approach was semi-successful. In 1935, the British government granted India limited self-rule, but not total independence. One issue that developed because of this is increased tensions between the Hindu majority and the Muslim minority. If you recall, the Mughal Empire was the Islamic empire that ruled over India before the British conquering, and there were Islamic followers who remained behind, many of whom were prominent in their communities. And they will fear giving up too much power to the Hindu majority. When World War II came around, surprise, the British did basically the same thing they did in World War I. Britain assigned Indian troops to the war effort, and they did so without asking India's self-governing assembly. Shocker. As you can imagine, this was widely unpopular among the Indian people and led to more calls for independence and increased protest around the country. When World War II finally ended in 1945, Britain was in so much debt that they basically couldn't afford to keep India under their control. So they finally granted India their independence. But those feuding Hindu and Muslim factions I talked about earlier began a series of violent struggles that made granting a clean break of independence difficult. So, because they still felt some responsibility for India, Britain decided they would make the final decisions for them. In 1947, Britain agreed to divide or partition India into two different nations. They separately grant independence to India and a new nation they just created called Pakistan. The idea is that the Hindu people can live in India and the Muslim people could live in Pakistan. This decision creates mass chaos, as basically overnight new borders are drawn and millions of people are displaced as they try to move to the country that offers their religion the majority rule. The violence is astounding, An estimated 1 million people died in the chaos and violence that ensued, including Gandhi, who was assassinated in 1949. In 1947, India became the world's largest democratic nation. You'll remember from our Cold War discussion that democratic countries were desperately trying to promote democracy around the world. Prime Minister Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, largely emphasized democracy and tried hard to modernize India. In many ways, the British left India stunted so that they would have more control over them. Prime Minister Nehru supported initiatives that gave women and lower caste Hindus like the Untouchables more rights. He specifically started charter schools for untouchable Hindus. In 1966, Nehru's daughter, Indira Gandhi, was elected Prime Minister, which I would like to comment is incredibly progressive considering no other democratic countries will begin to have female leaders for at least another almost 15 to 20 years. Unfortunately, India's democracy does not progress smoothly, and many of its leaders meet untimely deaths. Indira Gandhi was killed by 2 of her own bodyguards after an unpopular law is passed, and future leaders in the next 15 years also meet similar fates. So this is another example like we've seen in Latin America, and later on in this video when we talk about Africa, where decolonization left countries unstable and without the supports necessary to create long-term prosperity and stability. Independence for Africans will come a little later, with the first pushes for independence starting in the 1950s. The very first colony in Africa to gain independence is Ghana in 1957. The road leading to independence for Africans happened very similarly to what occurred in India. Africa's resources were used by their mother countries throughout the 2 world wars, and once World War II was over, they started to gain local self-governance. Starting in 1947, a man named Kwame Nkrumah used Gandhi's nonviolent strategies like boycotting goods and strikes against British companies to pressure Britain to grant them independence. Nkrumah's ultimate goal was to create a pan-African society, so basically one united Africa, kind of similar to what the United States has with our state system. This, of course, does not end up happening, basically because most African states have different religions, languages, and cultures from their neighbors, and the only thing they really see themselves as being unified in is the fact that they're from the same continent, which really isn't enough to make, a pan society. So after a decade of struggle, Britain finally grants the Gold Coast of Africa independence in 1957, and they will rename the nation Ghana, kind of in a reference to the Empire of Ghana that was prominent previously in Western Africa before the rise of Mali. Nkrumah was then elected president for life, a title that always seems to end poorly in our studies of world leaders. Nkrumah tries to modernize Ghana during his time in office by promoting infrastructure projects, establishing a more intensive education system, and a series of health programs for his people. But he was sadly overthrown in a military coup in 1966. A turnover of military leaders and some civilian leaders has plagued the country until around the year 2000 when they had their first real democratic election. So what happens in Ghana carries some similarities and differences compared to other African states fighting for independence. In South Africa, things will carry out a little differently. Their independence movement will be led by their white colonists. They actually gain independence earlier than many of their neighbors, which I believe is in no small part due to the fact that it was kind of the white individuals pressing for independence from the British government. Those same white people then gained all of the political power in South Africa and created a policy called apartheid, which held strict racial segregation laws between black and white people in South Africa, which is just crazy to think about when you think that these white people came to Africa as colonists and they're the minority in this country, and they're able to control all of these native peoples of South Africa. Black South Africans widely protested the apartheid movement and did not adopt the models of nonviolent retaliation like Gandhi or Nkrumah. They instead often started riots and brought large amounts of media to cover the abuses of the system. It was a pretty well publicized event worldwide. One of the largest advocates for the anti-apartheid movement was a man named Nelson Mandela. In 1964, Mandela was arrested and given a life sentence for opposing the government's apartheid laws. He spent decades in jail for this. Fun fact though, Mandela's favorite literary work, which he talked a lot about from his time incarcerated, was Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. because he said it's basically the story of Africa, which is poetic, but also kind of sadly accurate. As time progressed, many nations actually began to refuse to trade with South Africa and applied sanctions towards the country in protest of their continued segregation. Remember, this is happening into the 1990s. Around 26 years after his incarceration, Nelson Mandela is released from prison by the new South African president, F.W. de Klerk, amid rising sanctions and controversy. In the early 90s, South Africa's parliament repealed all apartheid laws and announced that they would have their first multiracial election in 1994. Before this, Black South Africans were not allowed to run for political office. Nelson Mandela won the election and became South Africa's first Black president. It's under Mandela that the parliament adopted a new constitution with the Bill of Rights that guaranteed equal rights for all citizens. Not all African independence movements go without bloodshed, though. For example, after gaining independence, Nigeria erupted in an ethnic civil war. In the Congo, a series of civil wars weakened the newly formed nation, and ethnic divisions also weakened Kenya's government, which led to violence and the eventual rule of dictators. This all stems from the fact that these countries were basically just cut loose from their imperialized mother countries and had no histories of self-rule as a nation to govern their decision-making. The border lines of the countries were decided by the Europeans, not the African people themselves, so the varying cultures and ethnic groups within any given country could vary greatly and have no real sense of unity of any kind. Therefore, much like what happened after Latin American countries gained their independence, the new nations often had shaky democracies that later led to dictatorships and violent revolts. Among the worst situations to develop from these poorly formed new nations are the genocides in Rwanda and the Sudan. In Darfur, the Sudanese government killed an estimated 400,000 Muslims in an attempt to destroy an anti-government rebel movement. In Rwanda, an ethnic conflict between rival clans led to the Hutus massacring between 500,000 to 800,000 Tutsis in 1994. While we here in the United States tend to focus on the genocide that took place during the Holocaust as being the primary genocide of the 20th century, there were actually many more that took place. As you can see from the map, the United Nations intervened in around 25 different accusations of genocide worldwide between 1945 to 2009. This is varying levels and degrees of fatalities, but I think we can agree that this is a problem that has continued to plague our world long after the Holocaust brought the term genocide into existence. Africa still faces many challenges today as it attempts to adjust to decolonization. African nations have a higher rate of human rights violations than any other continent, and also experiences more health issues than anywhere else. The AIDS epidemic is one of the most prevalent medical issues in Africa today. Colonization and then the gradual decolonization of Africa and Asia greatly shaped the political, social, and environmental spheres they live in today. And hopefully now you're able to kind of trace the present-day status of these nations to the history that brought them to that point. So thanks for watching.